Okay, today we will talk about external streaming. I called it streaming with Payload, but actually you will learn during this presentation that all of the streaming we have is streaming with Payload. It's just a question of what type of payload we include. So we'll talk about what is Reltio event streaming, how event streaming works. And let me step aside here a little bit. And we call it event streaming or message streaming, and this is the same thing actually. Supported types of the queues and non-limitations there. How to deal with the message size limit? That's a very popular question. Event streaming architecture, why there is no first in, first out, and what to do about it, how to order events specifically. How do I filter event stream and how filtering is working, and we will do a deeper dive into the event filtering and go through some things that are not even documented today. We are only working on documenting them, but they are already supported. Payload configuration today and in the future. Delta event streaming, this is something new that's coming in the 21.3 preview and then release. And then we'll talk about getting the best value out of event streaming and how to use it, best practice, and the future plans. Where are we moving with this? So let me just remove this so it's not overlapping the view. What is Reltio event streaming? It's a service in the Reltio platform which enables you to stream internal queues to the outside, so you can read them, filter on them, and include some content into them, and they're streamed in the JSON format. We have a console UI. This part is called tenant management. In the tenant management, you can control your streaming. You can add more and use new queues or streams to the tenant. You can enable, disable them. You can filter them. You can select the type that you wanted to add. So basically, you can configure them. It supports filter by event type. So you can say, I want to receive only these types of events into this specific queue. It supports, the service supports object filtering the same manner as search and export does. It supports payload. Again, I already mentioned it, but basically you can say I want or I don't want to include attributes into my events. I don't want to include crosswalks into my events. Only create time, or I also want to see update time as well and stuff like that. New that is coming, payload may be configured per queue. That's actually already supported. That's not new that is coming. The only new part that is coming is we will also support console UI for that, so you can configure it through UI. If today you have access to the tenant physical configuration, you can already do that. The news that is coming is streaming of Delta payload. Same thing here. It's already supported since like a couple of weeks in the physical configuration, but documentation UI was not rolled out, so officially it will be rolled out as part of 21.3. Also coming in the release this September-October time is payload configuration was moved down one level to this queue level. So basically, before you had to set up whether you want to include attributes, yes or no, on the tenant level. Now you can do it per specific queue, and you can have multiple queues for one tenant. And also something that's coming, you can have multiple destinations per single queue. We'll talk about this a little bit later here. Next slide. Yeah, here. So how do I remove this? Sorry. How event streaming works. And I have a schema here, which is, kind of flow of the update and how it goes into the external queue that is configured on the tenant. Let's say I have some data load, or I'm just posting an individual update of, to entity A here through the REST API. I posted it. Let's say it created entity A instead of updating it. It just created entity A. An event entity created will be generated and sent into the internal CRUD queue. At the same time, after I created entity A, it got merged and then merged with already existing entity B. Again, in the system internally, entity changed event will be, or message will be generated for this entity B and sent to the internal CRUD queue. These two entities will merge into AB entity, I just called it that. And then entity merged event will be generated and again sent into the internal CRUD queue. This internal CRUD queue is used to synchronize versions of the entities or other types of objects like relations between the primary data storage and secondary data storages like index, for example, which is used for search, or match storage, which is used for match and merge. If you configured 1 or 2 or 3 external or whatever number there is no limitation today, there's just best practice, queue for your tenant, external queue for your tenant, you will also be receiving all of these events into your queue. So in this specific case, I created 2 queues, and that one I put a filter on it that I only want to receive entity created types of events into this queue. So I will only receive this event here. And this queue, I configured that I want to receive other types of events or not entity created. And I also want to use some object filter here. So I don't know, I only want to receive events that came for attribute name, HCP entity type, attribute type name. And I'll be only receiving, events in this queue for this type of events. There's an important note here which says, that you shouldn't really create like tens or hundreds of queues per tenant. We recommend to use between 1 and 3 queues, and this is what all of our customers usually use. And we don't recommend to use more than 5 external queues. Now, why would I use that? Where do I need to use that? Obviously, with this filter and everything, it allows you, to do segmentation. You will receive active notifications. You don't need to go back into the tenant and check whether there are any changes in the entity. You will receive this event, so it will be, it's an active way of monitoring the changes in your tenant. But the previous kind of way of using it was I'll receive an event which only tells me that there is some change in the entity and there is a URI of this entity. And I'll do an additional get API call to get this entity, and understand the change in it and consume it and propagate into my downstream system. Today, you can configure payload. You don't need to do this additional get. There will be no additional query into your primary storage, which will not only do less impact on your performance, it will also work much faster. You get everything you need here already. And as I already mentioned, you have flexible filtering. And only things you need to take care of are event size things, which we will talk about later, and ordering as well. So to the next slide, which types of queues we support today and some limitations on them. So we support AWS SQS, and the biggest limit here is maximum event size allowed is 256 kilobytes. We also support GCP PubSub and Microsoft Azure, and the limitation and event size there is much better in terms of how bigger message I can put into the queue. In the projected future, which I'll projected future here is really release 22.1, between 22.1 and 22.2. We also want to start supporting direct streaming into Kafka. A lot of our customers asking about it, and really actively putting this, reviewing this and putting into our roadmap right now. So Reltio platform stream all these events into these types of queues using the same JSON format. So platform itself will stream events into any of these queues in the same JSON format, which is a non-decorated JSON, meaning no additional spaces, carriage returns, or any other characters is added. But important note here is there are 2 important notes. First of all, these queues may have their own schemas put on top of them. I mean, we recently hit this with PubSub, which in Google PubSub, you can have your own schema on top of it. And once you stream your event into PubSub, it will change the JSON. It will format it according to this new schema. By default, it matches what the format we stream, but you may have non-default, so check that. Another important note: we unfortunately had some events in the past where whoever implement the consumer for the queue would implement the parser as a string object, not as a JSON. So obviously, schema will impact this. Will have a heavy impact on this. If you parse your message as a stream, any change in the schema will break the implementation. We'll have to change the code. If you parse it as JSON, changes in the schema will not impact you. So we always recommend to parse messages as JSON, not as a string. How to deal with the message size limit? We just mentioned this right, and the most popular queue is AWS SQS queue that we use, but the limitations are 256 kilobyte is not, is not ideal. A lot of messages that you will stream, especially with Payload, will have a bigger size than that one. Today, you have to make sure that you have large object support enabled in your tenant configuration. And if it is, there'll be additional flag or attribute added to your message, which called exceed queue size limit. Reading this attribute from the message, you will always understand whether it is true or false, basically whether a queue size limit was exceeded or not for this specific message. If it's false, just process your message as usual. But if it is, you'll have to do an additional get API request to get the actual data, because that flag tells you that payload was removed from the message. So you will still receive the message, you will read it, but the payload will be cut from it. So you have to do additional get API request to get the actual payload. We recommend, this is the best practice to implement consumers for external streaming today. We recommend to always have this piece of code. You will see, as I'm presenting further, that our approach is to go into more kind of narrowed down granular filtering capabilities, which will allow you to only receive a piece of data you're interested in. This way, you will overcome the limitation. We also recommend to always use archived or zipped format of the message. We have plain JSON and we have zipped JSON. But even though you still may hit the limit, and there is a way to kind of overcome that. And it should be same as exponential backoff. You should just have this piece of logic there, even if it will never work for your tenant because you have fairly average or small size of entities, and as a result, average or small size of messages, and will not hit this limit. Still have this logic. If in 99.9% of cases you will not need it, but you will need it in 0.1% of cases, you better have it.
Hey, Dmitry.
Yeah.
Quick question. How do you enable the audit log for each event?
Audit log for each event?
Yeah, how do you enable the audit log for each event?
Let me explain. Audit log and events, those are two separate concepts and services today. So they're not kind of, how could I say, they're not bind one-to-one, and there is no way to bind them today. But we did something else. We did streaming of data in the audit log format right into the queue. This is I'll show you in the end of my presentation, but that's how we did about this. But there is no way to bind activity log to events one-to-one today.
Cool. And one other question for you, Dmitry. You mentioned that in 21.3, all tenants will have large object support enabled. Is that all tenants or all new tenants?
All tenants, because we will not be enabling it on tenant level, we'll just enable it on the platform level. And it's completely backward compatible, so nothing will be interrupted or impacted. You just have this. That basically means that you'll start receiving this flag in all of the messages. But if you didn't parse it, you just just keep receiving it, and that's it.
Cool. Thanks, Dmitry.
Yeah, one question. Sorry. It is related to the same question what Chris asked. Audit log for each event, we want to log it. What is the message ID? Like what is the unique ID has been triggered by the Reltio, and we need that in the log. So that the reason is for the traceability we are asking.
Understood. I think we had a number of customers asking for that. I'll definitely put it in the roadmap and in review. it's not that we don't want to do that. It's just, again, from the beginning, those are two different concepts. So sometimes, at least in the past, I can tell you for sure, for some cases, two different events will end up in a single activity log record, or vice versa, because they created and triggered separately. But I think today we can do that. Especially, I'll just repeat, we just build a payload type, we call it deltas now, which stream activity log format right into the message. So I think we can support that. It's not supported today, but definitely, consider it for the roadmap and in the nearest future, not like in 2 years roadmap or something.
Yeah, and Dmitry, I put that in. I put a link to our ideation portal. I guess you click on that, create a login or log in if you have that, and then put your idea there, because a lot of our customers and and partners will go there and upvote it and things like that. So it's a great place to put that.
Okay. Yeah, agree. Thank you, Chris. So should I continue?
Please.
Yeah, events, thank you. Event streaming architecture and why there is no first in, first out. This is, again, very popular question, because that's another thing, as I mentioned, we just talked about size limitations, but the second thing you kind of struggle with and you need to deal with is messages are not necessarily sorted by timestamp. And basically, you need to, if you'd like to make sure that in the downstream, if you persist this data or propagate it further, it's propagated in the time order as changes were happening inside of the tenant, you need to take care about that. First of all, why this happens and why first in, first out in the external event stream queue would not help, because AWS, for example, has first in, first out SQS type of the queue. So, obvious question is, why don't you just support that and it will be a FIFO here? But the answer is, it will not be there. It will not be that, because events will already come unsorted inside of the external queue. So the first in will not be the actual first from the system. Why is that? Is because, for example, we have a REST API and we have a data load. We have multiple post entity calls for a single entity, for multiple entities, but a lot of them come for a single entity. They'll be processed by parallel data processing nodes in the data processing layer, because our platform scales horizontally in a very efficient way, and nodes can be added on the fly while this data load happens, and that often happens actually. So new nodes may be added, and some of the messages will be streamed into the new nodes. Now, nodes can process, normally they'll process events in the same, the same cadence, same place as they, receive them. And normally event A will be processed by node A first, and then second event B will be processed by node B second, and we'll get first in, first out here. But sometimes, for various reasons, maybe milliseconds change, maybe even seconds delay. In worst case scenarios where something really wrong happened and specific node got hang, it shouldn't happen, and normally it does not, but you may have, I don't know, a gap in the platform, in the product, in the release, whatever. A specific node did not process event in time, and say event A, first event, went out of this part of this node much later than event X that came much later here and should come later, but it came first. It will go into the external queue first, and only after that, maybe, I don't know, 10 seconds later, event A came out of node A here. So there will not be first in, first out already here. It'll be vice versa. This is why supporting FIFO here doesn't make any sense, and instead we should do something different. So let's look at what we should do about that. So today, the best way to kind of sort your events is to add update date timestamp into the message payload. It's not there by default. Instead, we have only create date by default. So you should add it here, there, and you should read this update date every time you consume the message to propagate further into the downstream system, or to persist them in the database. You should consume this field, and you should compare it to what you already persist in your database, or whatever the aggregation point you have, in the pipeline. And basically compare that what you have about this entity ID has later or earlier update date already. And if it's you already have the latest date, and something earlier came to, you just ignore it. This is what we recommend. Starting 21.3, you'll not need to specifically add this field into the payload. It will be in the header of every message. Other options, for example, you can do aggregations in things like Kafka. Today, again, we don't support this direct streaming to Kafka, so you'll have to restream from SQSQ to Kafka. In Kafka, you can implement your own processor, and you can use key-value store, this Kafka specific thing. So if you ever work with Kafka, you know what processor is and what key-value store is. And in the key-value store, you would put a timestamp as a key and aggregate and sort events by timestamp there. And you can define aggregation period, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, something longer. I don't think it makes any sense to aggregate events for like 1 minute or more, because it may be too many events to aggregate, but you can do that as well. In, again, 99.95% of cases, that will do. But I would still keep the logic of checking the update date timestamp, just to have it, because that will solve 100% of all cases. Okay, if no questions, I'll continue. How do I filter event stream? So let's talk about filtering. I can filter, as I already mentioned, I can filter by type of event. And I can also use object filter. This is the same filtering we use in search and export, and this is very flexible, very kind of. It allows you to do a lot of segmentation type of things. And combined with use of multiple queues, or as I'll show you later, multiple destinations, it's a very powerful tool. So just some examples of how you can filter. You can filter through all attribute values by specific values. You just say attributes, whenever there is an attribute with value unique, any attribute, I want this event to go through. Or fuzzy search, if there is something like Mike or Michael, whatever, in the attribute, in the name attribute, in the message, I want this message to get through. You can do any type of exec search. You can even use regexp, to filter the, not search filter, I should say filter. You can do regexp filter to filter in or out the messages that you have. You want to consume that, don't want to consume that, just filter. You can obviously do all types of range, greater than, less than, greater or equal than, greater or less than type of things. There's an example here. This is an example from our documentation directly. Let's do a little bit of a deep dive into filtering. What else can you do?
Hey, Dmitry, before you go to this deep dive, quick question. Is there a way to know if any event was not published for an entity update due to some internal area within the platform? So we have our audit logs for event traceability once we get the message on SQSQ.
Yes.
But any failure prior to SQS message, we have no visibility. How would we ensure, which event or record was not sent to SQSQ?
This is a good question. So, and we have a good picture to answer this question. As I already mentioned, all messages or events that's propagated to the external queue are always propagated from the internal CRUD queue. We call it create, read, update, delete queue, but it's just internal queue. In the Reltio console UI, in the tenant management, you have visibility into this queue. It's called internal queue there. So you can manage your internal queue. You can actually monitor your internal queue. If you click on the monitor internal queue, you will see two types of monitoring there: failures and dead letter queue. If you would have anything failed to be propagated from here to here, you would see it in one of these two views: error messages or dead letter queue messages. This is the same pipeline there. Once something failed, it will be retried actually a lot of times, about 700 times through an exponential timeout. So first it will be very short timeout and it will be longer. But for a long period of time, this queue will try to resend this event into this queue. If it completely fails, it will appear in the dead letter queue and you will see it there. And this is how you know. So obviously you always have visibility into something failed. This is how you know that this is failed. If something would fail before this internal queue, we have an internal service that monitors this internal queue. We just introduced it in the beginning, I'd say middle of 2019, beginning of 2020. I don't remember exactly when, but we introduced it as part of the queue of the platform core. It's called queue synchronization monitoring service, and it will repeat any missed messages. Since we introduced this service, we see, I would say, no messages lost. Yeah, not even almost no messages lost. Sometimes you will see extra messages going out in the outside queues. So this is one of the things to consider. And this is why it's hard to bind messages to activity log, by the way. Sometimes messages may be repeated from here to here. So you should make sure that you don't consider messages to be unique. Sometimes we will just repeat them just to make sure you receive them in the downstream system. The messages can be repeated and duplicated. But this is how we make sure that nothing is lost.
Thanks, Dmitry. That's it.
Cool. Let's continue a deeper dive into the event filtering. So just two things to consider. Filter can be configured per destination, and multiple destinations can be configured per queue. This is not documented anywhere, but we will definitely document. But if you ever saw the configuration in the physical time configuration, the configuration of the queue, you see that it's actually called destination there. And the way we work with it today through our UI is one destination is allowed per one queue, but you can actually have many. And starting 21.3, it will be allowed. Starting probably 22.1, we'll also build a UI for that. Today, one destination per queue, so you can have multiple queues, same thing here. And let's consider next example use case. I'd like to receive, and this is actually a real use case from a real customer. I'd like to receive a message only if there was a change in a particular attribute. Any change, but I'd like to know that there was a change in this attribute. To address this use case, you would create two queues. You would configure one of them to only receive entity created type of event, and only for specific type of attributes. So if there was an entity created with this attribute, it did not exist before, you would receive it here. But if there was a change to already existing entity and this specific attribute, you would receive a filter called changes, and you would mention this specific attribute there, and you would receive it in this queue. Why do I need two queues in this case? Because changes, it uses delta, and when something is created, the delta will be empty, and you will not receive this event here. Sometimes this is, again, not properly documented. We working actively on improving our documentation, but this is something that not always well understood by our customers and partners. And if something new is created, I would not receive an event here, and I would think that something doesn't work. Instead, you should have two queues in this case and process separately creations and updates. Payload, real quick rush through Payload. Today we support Payload. You can configure it in this field. You can put multiple different types there. What's not supported, you cannot filter OV changes only, you would receive everything. And you cannot go too granular there. So if you say attributes, you will receive all types of attributes. You can filter events using the filters before, so you will only receive event if specific attribute change was done, but you will receive an event with a payload with all attributes. So event itself will change, our message itself will be big, and if it exceeds the limit of the queue, you'll have to go with the technique of get API call. If you keep this parameter empty, you'll receive everything. So it's not intuitive today, but this is how it works. By default, it's never empty. By default, you'll always have your right type created by and created time, this for. If you just create a default queue from UI, you'll have this for. But if you go ahead and remove everything, instead you start receive everything. Starting 21.3, we will first of all improve our UI, and we will let configuration of this payload through our console UI. And also we introduce some new type of delta of payload called delta. So we'll talk about in this next slide, but that's really cool. This is something that should, improve the use of streaming a lot. In the future, we'll definitely, where are you going to move, with all that? We're going to move into more granular and flexible configuration for the payload itself. I would say that filtering on the events, what I receive or not receive, is very flexible today. But if in addition, I want to narrow down to a very specific piece of update, very specific piece of entity I would like to receive. So I don't want to receive the entire entity. I want to do it for two reasons. First of all, reduce parsing efforts. And second, limit the size of the message. This is where we're going to go in our product roadmap overall, and obviously improve the UI capabilities to configure all that. Delta event streaming will be coming in 21.3 preview, already implemented, so it'll be there. This is how we configure it. So additional attribute on destination level is added, and you can have two values there, deltas or snapshot. Snapshot of the previous one, we just talk about it, the previous slide, where you can say, I want to have attributes and crosswalks, stuff like that. But if instead you say deltas in this configuration, you'll start receiving payload always in activity log delta format. Same as if you ever used activity log API and you parse this activity log JSON that you receive there, it'll be the same format here. So say I have entity changed event for this entity, and I will receive a payload in the format deltas. Was any of the OV value changed, yes or no? And then that the old value and the new value for this specific attribute here, and which source is associated with this update. And this is the only thing I'll receive from this event. So I know exactly what changed, from which source it changed, and how it was changed, basically what was before and what is the new value there. This is new. This is what we added in the coming release. And with that, I think I'm ready to switch to questions and answers. Before, I'd like to reiterate on kind of best practice real quick. So always try things in the lower environment first before going to production. Always use JSON parser to parse your messages. We recommend to use payload, and now this new deltas payload is something you can use instead of going back to REST API and do a get on every event you receive. We recommend to process events asynchronously. So basically, consumers should be implemented asynchronously. You should not wait to parse new current event before consuming the new one. Instead, you can consume them in the thread pool and just parse them in parallel while receiving them. Jacques, I know you're on the call. Anything else you'd like to recommend as a best practice here? Anything I missed maybe? And I'll stop sharing.
No, I think you've covered it, Dmitry. Thank you.
Hey, Dmitry, and we do have one question here, but feel free to ask some other questions here in the chat as Dmitry answers this one. So Delta Payload will also publish non-OV values? That's question mark.
Yes, good question. Today, yes, but the next step there, which will be added, I think before between 21.3 and 22.1 is this next filter. This is exactly next thing in the roadmap: filter delta by OV non-OV. But today, yes, you'll receive everything. You only have indication of what you received. Did it impact OV attribute, yes or no? So you can filter out non-OV, but you'll receive it and you'll have to have the logic to filter it out.
Great, thanks. Not as many questions today as usual. Usually we're getting like 15 or 20 of them. So you must have been extremely clear, Dmitry. And you know, folks like Sandra, I don't know if you have any other questions. You know, he usually does, not usually too shy, but please feel free to ask them. So next week, please look at the community.reltio.com and go to the events tab. Oh, good, Sandro. And sign up for some other webinars. So we do have one next week that I'm super excited about as well. What else? Anything else, Dmitry, for kind of last? Wait, we have a question. So with the Delta event streaming, we do not need to call an API again to get the latest information for an entity. That's a question.
Exactly. Yes, this is why we implemented it, and just make sure that you aggregate and sort events so that you receive the latest one by timestamp, as I mentioned before, and then you have everything you need in this exact payload with Delta. You don't need to do and this is the best practice, and we would recommend customers to start using this widely, even for all use cases. Whenever you have an active streaming, and if today you have an implementation where you just receive an event which by default will only have, I'll repeat, URI, type, who created, who made the change, and when the entity was created. Instead, and then you will have always, once you receive this event, you'll have to always go back to your REST API and do a get to this specific entity using the entity ID you got from the event, and understand what changed there, parse everything, compare somehow. You normally have complicated logic to understand what change just happened to kind of get it and propagate to the downstream or persist somewhere in the downstream. You don't need any of that anymore. You just receive the event. You already have a delta there. Just parse the delta, stores the change, that's all. That's very simplified a lot.
Great. Hopefully these are helpful. Please post in the chat if you think these are helpful. And if they are, and there's other, you guys keep coming, so it must be helpful, but we are looking for other topics that are going to be of interest to you. Every now and then I'll get a topic or two, and then I'll go in and talk to the right person about it. So please feel free to put your comments in the chat as we're kind of closing this out. Dmitry, thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris. And I think, just to add one more thing, a lot of things I was talking about today, this is very new. So I think we need to let everybody kind of consume it and digest, and then there'll be more questions about it, I'm sure. So, and much better, greater documentation is coming. So feel free to ask questions in the community about any of that, or you'll be able to read about all this in our new documentation as well.
As a matter of fact, Mark yesterday asked a question in the community about kind of an area around this, and thanks to Jacques, he went in and had a really good answer to it. So please post your questions in the community as well as they come up. As of this, I think we're finished now, Dmitry. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I look forward to seeing you next week and the other weeks to come. So also get on the community, post your questions. Let's connect to each other, and just let us know if you need anything. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to stay on for a minute or two, but good stuff. Very, like you said, I think it's kind of new to folks, Dmitry. So
thank you.
It's really good. All right. Well, I'm going to drop off now. So, all right, Dmitry, thanks again. Jacques, thanks for coming. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.